Chapter 11. Selah University. Octavian turned them in a southeastern direction, following roads that had narrowed on either side from the advance of the forest. Octavian was careful to point out any brambles or thorny weeds to protect the integrity of the suits. He was in his element. Kenia could read the alertness of his body and the extra spring in his step. There were fewer ruins along this stretch of road. In their place was beauty, offered in the untouched forest, the profusion of meadow flowers, and the steady hum of insects and birds. The slow decay of civilization had been replaced by the self-renewing cycles of nature. The interlude of serenity was such a relief that Kenia was actually disappointed when they came upon the buildings of the campus proper. The brick pathways among the academic buildings were visible, even as weeds had grown between the cracks, displacing the mortar and disrupting the uniformity intended by the masons. Octavian pointed out dorms, lecture halls, and a gymnasium. The campus had less a ghost town feel and more that of an Aztec city, abandoned in the jungle. Absent were the plain lines and unadorned facades of mid-20th century buildings. These academic buildings were constructed with flourishes, detailed cornices, and even the occasional stained glass window. It was not a college built with leftovers for students without futures. The buildings had once displayed all the trappings of grandeur she was used to at Georgetown. The architecture reflected optimism, granting legitimacy to the dreams of the founders, the faculty, and the students. At once grounded in the past and pointing to a future, but most importantly aspiring to something greater than the school itself. They stopped on the path at the far end of the quad before a manor house much older than the other buildings. The ceiling had caved in decades before, collapsing the second and third floors below it. In the grass was a toppled statue, ignominiously face down in the dirt, one of the arms broken in two by the fall. Octavian studied it, sadness creeping into his voice. This was the house where Leonard and Selah raised their family. It was converted into the first building of the university. This statue is of Leonard Bridgewater. Kenia took a deep breath. It wasn't that she was unmoved, but she was suddenly uncomfortable. She was not sure if it was the filtered air or the stuffy suit, but she felt dizzy. A pinprick of pain growing between her eyes, like the beginnings of a migraine. In her suit, she could not rub her temples or even pinch the bridge of her nose. Instead, she turned her body back around to face towards town. "Shall we make our way back, Octavian? This suit is getting warm." "Yes, of course," Octavian said. What she could see of his expression looked downcast, as if the melancholy of the place had finally seeped into him as well. They took a different route back. Taking a closer look at some of the classroom buildings and residence halls, Octavian pointed out a charming chapel, the old school well, and a greenhouse that had morphed into a profusion of life, literally bursting, the interior plants pushing the windows outward as the year-round warmth and moisture had allowed the non-native species abandoned there to flourish over the decades. Octavian was explaining how the biologists who came to visit the island found this greenhouse fascinating and had published numerous papers on it. But Kenia found it difficult to focus on his words. The sensation in her forehead was growing so that her thoughts felt scattered. Her ability to process what he was saying impaired. They were slowed further, where the path skirted a creek that had eroded into a ravine and taken a portion of the trail with it. Kenia tried to keep up and did her best not to come across rude or uninterested, but at this point her anxiety to leave, the pain between her eyes, and the claustrophobia driving her to shed her suit were all growing unbearable. When they finally returned to the town square, she was sweating so much that her visor was beginning to fog. She walked alongside Octavian, trying to be subtle as she picked up her pace, but Octavian had recovered his enthusiasm as historian and seemed to be finding a point of interest to stop and examine every few steps. Kenia could no longer even understand his words for the ringing in her ears. She tried to remember the symptoms of chlorofluorine poisoning, but could not recall a single one. Then it happened. A sudden rush, like her body was being squeezed all around and then flung as if out of a giant slingshot. The pressure behind her eyes seemed to snap and disappeared. She staggered, braced as if for an impact. Her eyes clenched shut, but none came. Her head cleared, and she opened her eyes. The shade of the forest was gone. She stood in unencumbered sunlight, the heat of it radiating through the suit. She could hear her heavy breathing, loud in her helmet, but alongside it, the serenity of the woods was broken with the sound of a marching band? Accompanying the band were cheers, applause, and the honking of car horns. This is a dream. I'm hallucinating again. She looked around, unbelieving, at an implausible scene, a marching band, brass instruments shining in the sun, the skin of huge drums gleaming white, while the players moved in step before a reviewing stand that had seconds ago been derelict. Now it was full of people and surrounded on all sides by a crowd, a mixture of black, white, and all hues in between. A man in a gray suit and a cafe au lait complexion stood at the podium. A darker, comely woman in a white blouse, blue skirt, and red sash stood next to him wearing white gloves and a box hat. They waved arms and clapped their hands as a regiment of uniformed men, colored and white, marched after the band in lockstep unity, saluting as they passed. The sign hanging over the bright, unfaded bunting read, "Welcome home, 132nd Infantry. Selah Station salutes its Korean War heroes." American flags fluttered in the breeze, blowing down from the mountains and across the town square. As the measured squares of marching soldiers passed, the townspeople threw flowers and confetti. Closer by, the youngest children ran about the square, while wives and mothers looked on proudly at their sons in uniform. The cars, the stores, the statues, the park benches, and the food carts she had just seen rotting were restored, as if untouched by time. It was a hallucination, she was certain, conjured by hypoxia caused by her suit. But it seemed so undeniably real. 4 tiny children, their shoes off, their pants rolled to their knees, were wading into the water of the fountain that moments before had been a fetid pool. The children were all different shades of brown and olive, with one white child who was turning pink with sunburn. Kenia lost her balance, her foot splashing down into the water and attracting the attention of the children. They stared at her, in her suit, wide-eyed. The youngest began to cry in terror. Then why not? She must have looked like a monster. She stumbled out of the fountain, sloshing her feet through the water, turning to where she had last seen Octavian. The hallucination robbed him from her sight as well. Instead, she saw a wall of people, their backs turned as they cheered on the passing of another phalanx of soldiers. It could have been Atlanta or New York for the mixture of black and white people next to one another, cheek to jowl. One man, however altered by the sound of the children's cries, turned and spotted her. He wore red suspenders holding up cotton pants. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and a derby hat rested at an angle on his head. A white press pass poked out of the ribbon around the crown. In his hands was an antique Kodak camera. He held it up to his face and the aperture clicked. Then it was quiet again. The rush of the fountain, the cries of the children, the voices of the crowd, all gone. The shade and silence of the woods had returned, and she heard the blessed sound of Octavian's muffled voice droning on. He stopped and began calling her name. She was disoriented, standing a stone's throw from where she had been before. Octavian was turned away from her, but found her quickly enough.
There you are. I lost track of you there for a minute. The peripheral vision on these things is terrible.
Her breathing was still heavy. She looked back at the swamp that was the fountain, the surface of the water covered in lily pads. A frog leapt and plopped into the muck. The grandstand was in ruin and abandoned, not a person or even a cat on its planks. No children, no soldiers, no families.
Kenia, you all right there?
I think I'm overheating. I need to get out of this suit. Back at the library, she took a tall glass of water from Octavian and drank it down in a series of gulps, then asked for another. They had driven back in silence. The suits returned to the trunk. Octavian was solicitous, his expression grave, his voice gentle. As she had recovered, Kenia had taken to reassuring him. It was just the heat, she said, taking another glass of water. And a headache. I'm still running a sleep deficit from the bus ride up, I suppose.
Have you had spells like this before?
He asked. She thought of her previous experience outside the MedDent building the day before, even her particularly vivid dreams of late. But what could she really say about them? What did she want to share? No, well, not really. She bought time by taking another long drink. Octavian was not ready to break off his attention, his piercing scholarly stare studying her. She had nearly finished the second glass when she was saved by a knocking at the door. A clutch of children in their church clothes pressed at the door.
Oh, I didn't realize how late it was,
Octavian said. You're open on Sundays?
Just after church, to catch some of the lunch, brunch, and church bunch.
He hurried to the door, greeting the children by their names. The children would never guess at his concern just moments before, but she could still hear the heaviness in his voice. Once the kids had disappeared into the aisles of the children's section, he returned to her. She handed him the glass and thanked him.
Do you need anything else? Something to eat?
No, thanks, she said, her mind shifting to another thought. Octavian, you said yesterday you had microfilm of newspapers going back decades.
To antebellum days, yes.
Would you have copies from the day of the incident at the coal plant?
Sure,
he said, his eyes narrowing in a question.
Are you sure you want to look at them now?
What can I say? You piqued my curiosity.
All right, follow me.
He set her up at the machine that looked like an old-school computer monitor, but was actually a projector screen for microfilms. She had used them in the school library, taking pleasure in how the old newspaper pages flew past in a rapid blur with only a minute motion of her hands on the knobs. Octavian loaded a canister from 1953, dialing the knob to August while headlines scrolled past, declaring the end of the war, the partitioning of Korea into North and South, as well as local news stories, the name Bridgewater showing up more than a few times. Finally, he slowed when he came to Saturday, August 22nd.
Here you go,
he said, and he went to attend to the children, calling for him from across the library. He brought his finger to his lips and shushed them, reminding them it was a library. Kenia turned to the newspaper, the Selah Station Picayune. The pictures of people, the cut of their clothes, the hairstyles, the cars, all so eerily familiar. The children's parents caught up to them in the library. They were also in their church clothes. Kenia felt self-conscious. She simply hoped they would not notice the black girl with braids and a sweaty tank top, her eyes unblinking as she slowed the scroll of the passing editions. The evening edition had not even featured the explosion, but the next day's front page was plastered with images of smoke and flames, devastation and evacuation, in tall, screaming letters. That was already too late. She dialed back to the evening edition from the day before, the back page coming first. There, in a little afterthought, space-filling column called Unexplained Events, she found what she was looking for. A fuzzy picture of a figure next to a fountain, dressed in a 21st century industrial hazmat suit. The visor obscured the identity of the person inside, but she recognized the scene. Down to the faces of the children looking up in horror, the caption below read, "An unknown person appeared to scare a few children at the victory celebration. According to reports, the prankster disappeared without a trace. He was there, and then he wasn't," said Sebastian Anderson, the photographer for the Picayune who took the photo. Strangest thing. Strange indeed, she thought, confusion and horror rising up in her own gut until she realized she had to run to the library bathroom for the second time in 2 days. This time, she did vomit.